Paul, thank you for that lovely introduction. And it is truly an honor to be here today. I'm going to be speaking about incorporating wearable technology into autism research. So in the field of medicine, we have some really clear examples where we can tell if our treatments are working. So in the case of obesity, we can put someone on a scale and see if they have gained or lost any weight. And in oncology, we can turn to radiology to see if a tumor is shrinking or growing. We don't have these types of measurements in autism. Autism is not that simple. It is a disorder of social communication and restricted and repetitive behaviors. And so what I'm going to show you today is a series of tools that I think are leading us forward to think about how we can improve measuring if our treatments are working. So what do we have right now? First, we have clinical observation. So somebody comes into the clinic and a clinician works with them. And this is limited by those who actually can come into the clinic itself. Two, we have parent report on standardized questionnaires. Our work, as well as many others, have shown that both clinicians and parents can be biased. In other words, a placebo effect. And so I'm going to show you a series of tools that we've been working on in the lab, as well as with my collaborators, using wearable and mobile technologies to flexibly measure behavior, so outside of the clinical setting, and also directly observing behavior from the child themselves. I'm going to talk to you about language. So we know that individuals with autism have challenges, both in terms of language production as well as the quality of that language. And what we've been doing there is using a recorder that is about the size of a credit card that fits into a t-shirt that the child can wear, that measures what the child is saying as well as the adults around them. We've been using smartphones and particularly developing mobile apps to be able to collect data from parents flexibly in their home. We've been using wrist sensors that we heard a little bit about this morning to measure sweat responses. And the idea behind that is to think about getting internal state of the child, a measurement of their internal state that we might not be able to capture from behavior alone. And lastly, we've been looking at gaze behavior. So individuals with autism have challenges with direct gaze, as well as shifting their gaze to other objects in the environment and then shifting back to other individuals. And so to measure gaze, we've been using a pair of glasses that have an outward-facing camera between the eyes that a parent or a clinician can wear that directly observes the child's gaze behavior. So to test these tools, we developed an 8-week protocol where we recruited school-age children with autism and their family members. And the idea is that we wanted it to mimic a clinical trial, but there wasn't actually any explicit treatment that was involved. And I'm going to pause and say, before I present all the data, that this was complicated. It took a lot of interactions with our research assistants to get parents to comply with using the t-shirts and using the wristbands in the home. And also, not all the kids would wear that wristband. So that's just to say it's not easy. That being said, we did collect a large amount of data that I'm going to share with you today. So I'm going to start by talking about language. So right now, the way that the field typically measures language in individuals with autism is you bring them into the clinic, or we are able to measure data in the home, but it's usually from toddlers or much younger children. So our goal here, one, was to be able to collect language information in the home in school-age individuals. And two, was to think about how we were going to analyze all that data. So what do I mean by that? We had over 300 hours worth of data that we had collected. And right now, the way that the field measures and quantifies this is somebody listens to that recording and marks down when the child is speaking and when the adult is speaking. That's error-prone, it's time-consuming, and in our case, that was just not physically possible. So we teamed up with a group of acoustic engineers at Georgia Tech who developed speech recognition software that now is at 90% accuracy, being able to tell us when the child is speaking versus when the adult is speaking. Now, 90% in acoustic engineering is very good, but we certainly are seeking to go to 100%, and where this work is going is thinking about not just when the child is speaking, but the quality of their language. And what I mean by that is the back and forth between a child and an adult. I'm going to turn now to the data that we collected on the smartphone. And the goal here was really thinking about ways that we could reduce burden on caregivers and allow them more flexibility to tell us about their child's behavior. So we teamed up with a group at Janssen to develop a smartphone app that allowed us to ask parents single questions on the smartphone. How irritable is your child today? How disruptive are they? And the idea was, could we ask single questions on a smartphone instead of these lengthy 30 and 50 question type of questionnaires that are very common in the field? What we found is that single questions on a smartphone coincided with these much longer questionnaires, suggesting that in the future, we might simply be able to ask a single question and not necessarily these longer questionnaire types of typically administered. Second, there's this conception in the field that if we repeatedly ask somebody for information, that more data is going to kind of drill down into the core of a behavior. And so we wanted to test that in our own data, asking, did we need all 8 weeks worth of information to understand a child's irritability, for example, or do we actually need less? And what we found is that we only needed data from the first and last 10 days of the study to get the same amount of information than if we had asked parents every single day across those 8 weeks. So what this is suggesting is that we have single questions on a smartphone that might be able to replace the longer questionnaires, and that we certainly don't need to ping parents every day to ask them about their child's behavior. I'm going to turn now to talking about the sweat response. When we started this study, the majority of research in this area was bringing individuals with autism into the lab and measuring their sweat response. And so when we started the study, we knew we wanted to be in the home environment, but we had to kind of create a whole new set of tools to be able to analyze the data. Similar to the language, it was not possible for someone to manually go in and tell us when was good data and when was bad data. So we established a set of pipelines, and we ended up with data like this. So what you're looking at is a single subject across 4 different days and their sweat response. So high values here is more sweat, and lower values is less sweat. And so looking at this, day 3 certainly looks different. It looks different for 2 reasons. One, its overall seems to be lower, a lower sweat day for this individual. And also the ups and downs are a lot less, right, in day 3 compared to the other days. So this was exciting to us that we were able to even measure this, but the question was, what did this mean? And so we turned back to the data we collected on the smartphone, and we found that differences that we observed in the sweat response coincided with what parents were telling us was happening in terms of their child's irritability. And so what this is suggesting is that the sweat response that is measuring this kind of internal arousal of the child is actually coinciding with what caregivers are seeing as well. Okay, so I'm going to end by talking a little bit about the gaze behavior that we've been looking at. And I just want to start by saying that this is data that was collected in preschool age children and in the clinic, but this is certainly tools that we hope to adapt to ultimately be used in the home. So right now, the way that our field typically measures gaze behavior and shifts in gaze is either a clinician observes them in real time, or someone goes through a video and marks down when the child is making direct gaze or when they're making these shifts. Similar, as I described before, this is error-prone and this is time-consuming. And so what we've been doing with my collaborators, Dr. Roska and Dr. Ray at Georgia Tech, is trying to automate these types of measurements. And the way that we've been thinking about this is using 2 different video sources. And so what you see here on the left is data that we collect from a standard camcorder in the room that can pick up objects and toys that the child is interacting with. And on the right, you see the viewpoint from the glasses that in this case are worn by the clinician, but also could be worn by the parent. So we are at a point now where our computer is able to detect when the child is making direct gaze at the exact same accuracy as if someone was going through the video manually coding it. And so what you see is when the box becomes green, that's when the computer is saying that the child is making direct gaze. And we're also able to predict where in space, specifically what the child is looking at in terms of objects versus people. And so the heat map here is representing where the child is looking. And you can see that there's these shifts between the person and the book. Ultimately, our goal is to fuse these two sources of information together. So what we're able to derive from the glasses with the direct gaze, with where they're looking in terms of objects versus people, to really be able to quantify those shifts that are occurring from people to objects and back to people, which is shared engagement. So in conclusion, we have a series of tools that I think have a lot of promise. We have automated language detection. We have single questions on a smartphone. We have sweat responses, and we also have automated gaze detection. So I started this talk talking about outcome measurements that are very precise. I don't necessarily think that we will be at a point in autism that will be quite to where I started, but I think that we're moving closer. And what's exciting to me about this field is that mobile and wearable technologies might not only be able to tell us if our treatments are working, but ultimately I think that they're going to be able to provide us information to improve the treatments themselves. So with that, I would like to say thank you, particularly to Kathy Lord, who was instrumental with this work, Amarel and Caroline, who helped collect a lot of the data, my current lab, and then my collaborators from Georgia Tech, Agata Rosga and Jim Ray, Mark Clements and his team, who were spearheading the acoustic analyses, Matthew Goodwin and Ian Kleckner, who were spearheading the sweat responses, and thank you.